For this week's class, we'll be talking about literature reviews, just the components, stages, and different types. And this module will help you prepare for your research proposal assignment that will be due later on this semester. So today we're going to talk about the purpose of a literature review, the steps to reviewing the literature, also the benefits of internet searches, how to find literature, and also making sure that your sources are credible. Also writing a literature review and the differences between quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods reviews, and additional characteristics of literature reviews that you want to think about. So what is a literature review? A literature review is about gathering information for your study and looking at articles that may relate to it. It's also about becoming an expert on a topic that's of interest to you, whether that is in student affairs, such as looking at African American student athletes or looking at the correlation between student involvement and student retention, or for counseling and psychology, maybe looking at the possibilities of different interventions, whether it's play therapy or looking at different psychological tests. It also looks at exploring a topic in depth and finding out what's missing. For example, many people may have looked at literature or looked at a specific problem through a different lens, but what you can do is even looking at where at the end of journal articles where researchers say where to go next, what is missing from that, and what are other problems or other issues that are still occurring where you can build your literature base and talk about another problem and frame it from your own perspective. In looking at the purpose of the literature reviews, one of the first things that we want to look at is how do we refine the research problem? What do we know about the current issue or current problem? Also to establish a conceptual or a theoretical orientation or a framework, and it relates to what we want to know. And in some cases, that theoretical orientation or conceptual framework is presented in a way that looks at different variables for what we want to study. For example, looking at Aston's theory of student involvement, it looks at inputs, environments, and outputs, which may lead to the different variables to study. The other thing is developing a significance mainly looking at, what will your study or what does the literature say is significant about this topic, and then how can you build a study from that. Also, identifying methodological limitations depending on what your initial research question is. For example, if you start a research question with, is there a difference related to students who are involved as to students who are not involved, it may mean you may need to look at the types of students in a quantitative study. Or if you want to explore how do African American students experience the college environment, that may lend more quantitatively. Do we look at interviews or do we look at surveys? It'll also allow you to identify some findings that contradict one another in terms of what we previously did or did not know. It will actually, and this is specifically for quantitative research, help you develop research hypotheses and also learn new information. So in terms of the purpose of literature reviews, it'll allow us to refine what the research problem is and hone into more specifics on what we want to study. Or if it's a qualitative study and there's not a lot known about it, we may want to go more broad. The other thing that it will give you, as mentioned earlier, is whether there are surveys or different variables that you can use. For example, like if you're looking at counseling, whether it's school or clinical mental health, and you want to look at the relevance of how play therapy helps helps children, or how play therapy can be used, some of those articles may give you some ideas on that. Or if you're looking at student affairs, if you want to look at food insecurity, it may give you some ideas whether there are other surveys or instruments to use in order to measure that, and how different authors or researchers have measured variables. Literature reviews also allow us to establish conceptual or theoretical orientations. For example, when you look at the conceptual framework, a conceptual framework is the lens through which you view a study. For example, you may want to look at Schlossberg's transition theory to see how individuals make various life transitions, and that may be a lens through which you do a qualitative study. Or as mentioned earlier, if you look at Aston's theory of student involvement in terms of inputs, environments, and outputs, those may give you some variables related to a quantitative study. It also situates the context for a study, looking at what type of questions were asked, what were the demographics. It also lets you link new theory to existing theory, comparing what was previously known to what is now known. And it establishes a link for compare and contrast for what has been done before. And also, in most literature or journal articles that you will find, at the end there'll be some discussion of how it relates to prior literature, but also it will provide some implications for practice. Additionally, literature reviews also helps us define for our readers and our audience significance of the study. It contributes to what we don't know about a certain characteristic, or whether it's about a population or about a specific intervention. It helps us formulate more research and more evidence-based practice. And it also links to previous studies, such as when you're reviewing the literature, you really want to get a solid base of what has been done before, how has the problem been approached, and what may be some changes that we can use for the future. What will it provide as a basis for future studies? Literature reviews also enable us to identify methodological limitations. For example, one of the limitations may be the subjects. For example, individuals may select either college students or other subjects basing on the population, the location, or specific characteristics. And sometimes those characteristics may not apply to future studies, or it could be different with a different population. The variables, looking at what is the best way to measure them, depending on your research question, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. It also gives you the idea of what procedures to implement, whether that's going to be you're conducting your study through interviews, through observations, through focus groups, or you're going to administer a survey to a group of individuals. It also allows you to improve the methods. Because one of the things that you'll find in a lot of journal articles that you'll read is the fact that studies do have a limitation section, and usually that identifies for the readers what population, what location, that it may not be in quantitative research generalizable or qualitative research transferable to all populations. So those are things that are helpful in terms of providing a basis for your own study or your own research proposal. Literature reviews also identify contradictory findings, and it may uncover reasons for various findings. For example, there could be different participants. Some may say that a tree may fall because it has too much water in it, for example, or some may say that a tree, may fall because it is dying. So those are two contradictory findings, but it could be because they're different trees and they need different types of care. So that if you take that to the research literature, different participants may yield different results depending on the location, depending on age, depending on how you selected the different characteristics. The other thing is the literature review may say that there may have been different procedures used which may yield different results, but even if someone conducts the study and uses the same procedures, if someone takes students from a public institution in the Midwest versus a private institution on the West Coast, there could be differences just because of the population or the characteristics of that sample or of that population that you're asking questions of. Also, in terms of literature reviews help you develop a research hypothesis. And for quantitative research, this is it's very important. It's one of the key things where you want to say, based on what we know, you could look at a hypothesis is not specifying any direction. For example, is there a difference based on gender and how individuals respond to a different treatment? And that may mean looking at the results and analyzing them by gender. But it also provides the basis, that previous literature provides a basis for that hypothesis. Literature reviews also allow you to become an expert on a very specific topic. You may have different areas of interest, whether it's in counseling, whether it's in student affairs, or whether it's in psychology. It allows you to become familiar with the terminology that's used in various interventions or various studies. You can become familiar with the methods, the different topics that other individuals have researched to formulate their approach for the study, the theories, and also authors and researchers, because chances are as you're doing your literature review, some similar authors or noted authors in your field would come up time and time again. It also gives you an example of different journals that you may want to look at, ones that are noted in your field. And one thing that I would suggest is, whether it's this class or through other classes, ask your professors what type of journals they read, or think about for readings that you've had before, where have those been posted? And also looking at the various practices that are associated not only with literature reviews, but within conducting studies in your field or proposing studies in your field. Next, we'll start going over how to review literature. The first thing you want to do is select a topic and identify key terms. For example, in the beginning, your research topic may be very broad. A previous example that I used earlier, you may want to look at African Americans and student athletes. You may also want to look at first generation students and retention. Or if you're looking at counseling, you may want to look at play therapy and its use with school counseling and adolescents. So you want to start broad and identify your key terms. Second thing you want to do is really access relevant databases, and this is where the library will be very helpful to you, especially the online research tools, whether it's Galileo, Google Scholar, or ERIC. Sometimes EBSCOhost or others may be very helpful too. Then you want to go ahead and conduct a search and see what type of articles it puts out, and identify then the type of sources, whether it's a primary or secondary source. Fifth, you want to go and summarize and analyze the information that you read. And then the next step would be to document all articles that you access so that you have a record keeping system for going back to them. And then you repeat the steps in the process. So the first step is you want to select a topic and identify key terms. The first thing that you want to have is a general idea of what you're looking for or what topic or area. And then you want to search related terms. For example, you may want to look at college students' experience, retention, or even looking at depression. If you're in counseling, you may want to look at depression and maybe a specific method like cognitive behavioral therapy in reducing depression. So look at those topics and identify key terms to be able to input into your search. Next, you want to access relevant databases, and this is where the library is definitely your friend. ERIC, there's the Education Resources Information Center that can be very helpful for you. There's also PsycInfo, which is another database. Google Scholar is helpful if you're on campus to get it, but if you're off campus, I think it will allow you to log in remotely and be able to download the articles. And then Galileo is also another database that you can use. So in conducting searches, you want to look at not only the subject, but also the title, the author, and then the specific time frames. For example, you may want to look at research within the past 10 years. And as you see below, there's another database search called EBSCOhost. You can look at, and I would suggest looking in a specific field rather than looking for the title of an article, just because it may or may not pop up in that search or specific database. But what you can do is look there and type in maybe your key search terms, for example, retention in college students and first generation, and it will give you articles within all articles on that topic. Usually on the left-hand side in the toolbox, it allows you to narrow the parameters of that search by a specific number of years. And one of the things you want to do is really look at research literature that has been done within the past 10 years because you want to be able to pull from one of the most recent first. However, there may be certain individuals in various fields that have been renowned throughout the years where you want to cite an earlier study to see that as well. So you want to identify the types of sources. One of the types of sources is primary sources, which are original research. And those have been conducted by authors and they've gone through an extensive peer review process, meaning that they've been reviewed by other researchers who review for the journal, and then they've been decided to be published in their field. So you really want to look at peer-reviewed resources. Secondary sources are reviews or summaries of some of the primary research, and it provides a starting point. There are three main types of secondary sources, which can be professional books or textbooks, encyclopedias, or handbooks. One of the things that you do want to look at is always have primary sources because those are usually the most credible and relevant when doing a literature review. For example, there are some cases where you may be able to cite secondary sources. For example, like if something is done only in Latin, then the secondary source is the only way to find it. Or if it's a study from 1915, the only place that you may be able to find it is a secondary source. But for the most part, you should be able to go for primary peer-reviewed research articles. And looking at the types of journals, there are two types. There are the refereed or referred journals and also the non-refereed or non-referred. So for the refereed journals, they are peer-reviewed. As mentioned earlier, they've gone through an extensive review process and sometimes revisions before those articles have been published, and they're highly respected. Non-refereed are ones that are usually not a peer-reviewed journal, but really anything goes. There's no editorial board. Those may be things that you've seen in a trade magazine or something else, but it's not refereed. And what you want to do is really go for the peer-reviewed resources. And usually those peer-reviewed journals only have a 10% or a less than 10% acceptance rate. There are also internet searches, and there are beauties to using the internet, and there's also dangers in terms of using the internet in terms of the fact that there's lots of information on the internet, And sometimes those sources can't be verified. They're not filtered in some way. So the important thing is really to stick to databases. For example, I'll give you something that's not filtered on the internet is Wikipedia. It may give you just a brief overview if you're looking up something, but it's not something that you're going to cite in a literature review or a research paper. There's other things that you may find on the internet, for example, anything that has a .org or a .gov or .edu. If you're looking at a research publication or even just a report from a .gov or a .org, usually those have gone through some process internally to verify what that report is. And it may be looking at statistical information, so it's okay to cite that. Google Scholar is also a good starting point to get you to see what has been peer reviewed and not peer reviewed, because you can click on that. But also you want to be able to check those sources as well. Educational associations and organizations, whether it's the American College Health Association, Journal of College Student Development, if you go to the American Psychological Association, or even the American Counseling Association too, those associations usually have journals, and authors in those fields are putting out research that have been reviewed. So you can ask others for suggestions on what journals to use, and sometimes it may pop up for different ones. Also, research your resources when you're doing research. Is it a respected source? Do other journals or other articles mention this source or not? Those are things that you can look at as well. So when you're looking at the literature review, summarize and analyze the information. There's differences between what's considered a brief review or an exhaustive review. Most of the time in journal articles, you'll see literature reviews about 3 to 5 pages, which would be considered a brief review. When you're looking at dissertation or theses, those are more like 15 to 20 pages, which means you really want to exhaust the literature to do this. So it's looking at what are the different characteristics. Quantitative reviews really are a synthesis. They're a summary of the articles, and it's not like a checklist, like I've reviewed this article, then I've reviewed that article. Think about going around the room and there's different conversations. How do you connect those conversations together in a summary in terms of what have been the main points from the articles and the takeaways? Quantitative reviews also analyze the studies and also critique them and critically think about them to think what has been done before and what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses or what are the gaps in that literature. Qualitative reviews usually have a conceptual framework. It foreshadows some problems, and sometimes the qualitative literature reviews are done in reverse. Sometimes individuals like to collect the information and then fill in the literature review because they don't want the literature to bias any preconceived notions, whether it's interviews or observations. Mixed methods reviews, there's usually a separate area for the quantitative and qualitative review sections, and then it just talks about connecting the different main points of the articles or areas for synthesis. One of the things that you want to think about in a literature review is documenting all the articles accessed. Sometimes you may want to use an Excel spreadsheet, organizing it by author last name, the title, year, or something that you're going to use to look at all the articles that you've accessed. Some people use an Access database. When I was doing my dissertation, I ended up having a Microsoft Word document, and what I would do was provide the APA citation, and then I would just annotate all of the articles that I ended up reading. But the important thing here is that you want to have a system for annotations and to be able to remember what you read. After you've gone through the process of reviewing the literature, what you want to do is go back and repeat and kind of exhaust the literature, where this means if you're starting to see the same authors and some of the same information found in each area, then you're starting to hit what we call there's no new information to be found, or what we call usually you've been saturated in the data for this field. So it's cyclical. One of the things I would suggest doing is, as you're reading articles, look at the reference lists and see what other articles or other things individuals have cited in theirs, because that will give you more ideas to move on for next articles or to search in similar topics. Here are some characteristics of good literature reviews. Good literature reviews cover the research topic. They cite findings from other research. They're current and up to date, with means usually within a 10-year period. They summarize and analyze the information well, with the focus on the major studies. Minor studies you do want to mention briefly, but really focus on the major studies. They're organized logically by topic, not by article. They relate to the research topic, and they also establish significance. So here are some concluding points on literature reviews. They're multifaceted. Look at using online databases to collect literature. Look at using the internet information, but also be careful of what information is on the internet. Focus on using primary versus secondary sources. Summarize the articles well, but also be critical of what the limitations and the benefits are in the literature and in the articles that you read, and highlight the study, what new information, and also one of the things that will help is the Creswell text, and the chapter on literature reviews will help you in doing your assignment, and also doing your assignment and also formulating a literature review for your research proposal.